So I had the pleasure of reading papers by all three of our emerging scholars. And I want to say that this is a group of emerging scholars who are really on a trajectory towards some terrific work. This is just the beginning of lots of really excellent work we're going to see. They're really doing some careful thinking, raising really important questions. They all write really well. It was a pleasure to read their manuscripts, actually. And I also just want to say it's just great to have the folks in the crowd here, including a number of our undergraduates who are here. Thank you for being here. And so when we think about the construct of equity, lots of folks define it in varying ways. But among the ways that we can define equity, folks typically talk about resources, structures, processes, and tools to promote equal opportunities and outcomes for individuals, groups, and society. Typically, the focus is on those historically marginalized, under-resourced, recipients of inadequate rights and responsibilities, and frequently a particular focus on underrepresented students of color in the educational context, Latinos, African Americans, and American Indians. So on the panel, what we heard were some diverse contexts as sites for equity explorations. Diversity first in terms of disciplines, English, history, and STEM. Physical sites and data sets. We heard studies that were close examinations of classroom pedagogy and student responses. We heard work on large data sets with disaggregated data. Entry points for the equity work were curriculum and instruction. And here I borrowed from Antero's work with Thomas Phillip, where they talked about texts, tools, and talk as a way to organize our understanding. So these are kind of elements of curriculum and instruction. We also heard about teacher thinking, planning, and knowledge development. And we also heard about higher education student surveys as entry points for equity work. When I think about equity, I think about ways in which equity entered the world of education. In the 1980s and 90s, James Banks, an African-American scholar of multicultural education, developed a typology of interrelated dimensions. And I think that this groundbreaking work is interesting and helps to organize some of what we heard today. But I also want to highlight ways in which members of our panel really sort of pushed the boundaries of these dimensions. So what you see here are these 5 dimensions that Banks had identified. And I'm not going to talk today about content integration or prejudice reduction, though these are very important. Content integration meaning the infusion of cultural content into curriculum, and I think we can imagine prejudice reduction. I want to highlight the other 3, however. So the knowledge construction process is one of the dimensions, and here's how James Banks defined it. The extent to which teachers help students to understand, investigate, and determine how the implicit cultural assumptions, frames of references, perspectives, and biases within a discipline influence the ways in which knowledge is constructed within it. In Maribel's work, we heard some attention to this dimension, but we also heard her exploring misconceptions and actual absences of historical knowledge and content of Latino histories. We heard about texts and students' constructions of meaning from them. And in her published work and other manuscripts, she really is talking about this notion of complicating a black-white binary, which is the way we typically have thought about diversity in the US educational context. She moves, as we heard, beyond assumptions that all youth of color hold progressive assumptions about culture, immigration, and language, and that they all have similar kinds of constructions of meaning. And we heard some very promising methods of engaging teachers in change, and this comes through in some of her other written work and in conversations that I've had with her. How is it that we might interact with teachers as we think about infusing more cultural content and thinking about sort of recasting and rethinking curriculum? A second dimension is equity pedagogy. Banks defines it as when teachers modify their teaching in ways that will facilitate the academic achievement of students from diverse racial, cultural, and social class groups. He goes on to talk about some other concepts that he developed in the late 80s and early 90s that have now been challenged and complicated. But what I want to highlight today are some ways in which Antero explored these. And I think in Antero's work we hear something beyond just modifying, but it's really overhauling and innovating pedagogy. And so in his work, he's really trying to think about if we're going to take seriously social media, digital tools as potential learning affordances, then what are the ways we have to really profoundly rethink classrooms and pedagogy inside and outside of school contexts? We hear in his work a commitment to linking tech resources, gaming, and learning, and critical pedagogy as a tool for equity. And running throughout his work is something that I absolutely love, which is it's deeply pedagogically centered. He says we cannot leave the teacher behind, and to do it is foolishness. The teacher remains central, and pedagogy matters profoundly. A third of the dimensions that Banks had articulated was an empowering school culture and social structure. Banks's definition was grouping, and think about this in terms of K-12 settings, and then we're going to talk about Juan's work beyond K-12. Grouping and labeling practices, sports participation, disproportionality and achievement, and the interaction of staff and students across racial and ethnic lines, that need to be examined to create a school culture that empowers students from diverse racial, ethnic, and cultural groups. I think this dimension helps to serve as kind of a jumping off point for some of the work that we hear in Juan's research. So first we hear Juan complicating the STEM disciplinary conglomerate. I think this is so important. It really comes through in his published work. We make assumptions that STEM is STEM, that there is this kind of umbrella, but folks in engineering versus the health sciences have profoundly different kinds of goals related to social justice, and it comes through in Juan's careful analysis of data. Also complicating the STEM student demographic, really trying to disaggregate by race and ethnicity. Questions about the very culture of STEM fields. Whoa, I think this is where we're starting to get into really thinking about school culture and social structure. What about higher education, the sort of cultures of disciplines and ways in which they are in fact constructed? And the value of integrating social justice and agency in STEM, particularly for underrepresented students of color who may be predisposed to hold these values and goals. So how can this become something that is really infused within these disciplinary foci? So I think about the research questions that these folks are asking. These questions that they ask really are equity tools. So I think here, I mention inspired by Santiago because I'm thinking about some of these are questions that in fact Maribel asked, and a few of them are ones that came to mind for me as I was thinking about her work. So first, what and where is Latino history? How has it been erased? Who knows it, and how do they know it? How might it be taught? What are diverse ways that Latino youth engage it? How can historical empathy matter in curriculum and instruction? And what might a rich curriculum in which Latino history is treated with complexity matter for youth engagement in learning? Some research questions as equity tools inspired by Antero's work. How can the explosion of gaming and digital tools be used to foster critical literacy? How can digital tools be scrutinized for innovation as opposed to, as he pointed out to us today, reproducing inequalities? What forms of pedagogy are possible and necessary to engage youth in meaningful, critical uses of tools such as these? And how do we keep pedagogical innovation central, examined, and complicated in such work? And some research questions as equity tools inspired by Juan's work. For whom among STEM students in higher ed does and might social justice matter? This comes through very clearly in his work. What can disaggregating STEM students by race and ethnicity and by disciplines within STEM reveal? And what kind of world might we have if STEM cultures infused equity into curriculum? And so I want to close then with just a few ideas about some possible topics that we could explore now in our question and answer. These are just some jumping off points, but I want you to feel free to explore anything you'd like. perhaps we might think about conceptions of equity. What are some of those conceptions that came through in the work today? Ways in which they're sort of pushing the boundaries and helping us to think about these. Any questions that you might have related to particular studies and their foci? Impacts and implications, and there are some really interesting implications. They're doing careful work, of course, that is attending to not moving right now beyond a particular thought-through study. But there's lots to think about as we start to imagine this work and the trajectories that will follow. Pushing boundaries of disciplines and fields. You know, as we think about some of these ways in which fields need to intersect in order to do this work. And then finally, can you imagine some next steps in research trajectories? Maybe you want to ask them about where they're headed next, or maybe you want to comment on what you think might be a really interesting next piece on their journeys. Okay, so let's open up the floor now to some comments, questions. Anybody? Harley, stand and deliver.
Hi. So my question is mostly directed at Professor Garibay. Is that how you say it? Yeah. Okay, yeah. So it seemed like your presentation, your work was on students' views, primarily, like their views. I was wondering what your opinion or your views are on the relationship between those views and what they will actually do. Because I feel like I could pull like an engineer off his campus and ask them about, like they want to affect social change. But when they graduate, if like a military contractor offers them a job and they end up making drones that will bomb Afghan hospitals, they will take that job. Because in the political economic context in which we live, a job is a job. So what are your thoughts on like what is necessary to cultivate such a deeply like anti-racist, anti-imperial, you know, deeply just politics in our STEM students such that they can resist these kinds of like political economic paradigms?
Hold on. Does that work? All right. Thank you for that question. I mean, that's a really profound question because I think, I mean, that's definitely something that I talk about in the paper is that values don't necessarily translate into action. But from a lot of work, a lot of empirical research, values do often relate to behavior. However, again, that doesn't apply for every single person. I think it would be great if you ever pass by an engineer to ask those questions, because I think, for one, survey research may not necessarily be able to get at that. I'd love to do kind of some follow-up work to see, when students do go into the field, how values might affect, for one, the positions that they might apply to, but also when they're actually maybe working on projects. Like, so thinking about, in the context of engineering, when they're working on projects, whether it's civil engineering projects and the impact on communities, whether they'll actually bring in those perspectives that, hey, we probably say shouldn't build a freeway in this particular community that breaks up, or we shouldn't, we should be thinking about issues of equity and how the project can affect the community. But yeah, I mean, I think that's where I think interviews would be really helpful, be able to contextualize, the particular things that they're thinking about as they're involved in this in these decision-making processes.
Are there ways to seed that kind of work early in K-12 education so that younger folks can have a conception of what STEM might mean, in terms of sort of being not just college ready, but community ready?
I'd probably toss that to the K through 12 people, but I think...
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Just wanted to throw that out there.
No,
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
That was a profound question, I agree. One of the things I was thinking about is how do we cultivate a critical consciousness in K-12? When you think about social justice curriculum, a part of that is one, teachers having a critical consciousness, but we're, the paper that I'm working on is thinking about how do we cultivate a critical consciousness where we can read the world through science critically. How do we think about science critically? How do we think about, if you think about that last slide that Juan had up, how do we think about and really understand that science is not as objective as we like to believe it is, and the impacts that it's had long-term, such that it motivates and inspires people long-term to think about these things and make that front and center in the work. So I think there's a space for it. It has to start with teachers and students at the K-12 level, certainly, so that those values can.
Other questions? Oh, sorry, an answer. Yeah, Tara.
I just want to, it was loud. I think I want to start with a question that you framed, and you started with the what kind of world would we have if, and I think that is the kind of framing we need to think through with the ways we approach the asking of these questions, right? So work that Maribel was engaged with before she went up to Stanford, and I worked with in UCLA was the Council of Youth Research, which is a youth participatory action research model. And the challenge is, I think, traditional paradigms of what educational research looks like in terms of who gets to ask the questions, what kinds of questions are asked, and who gets to decide what kinds of findings are shared with whom and how we act upon those, right? And so this process of cultivating a critical consciousness, right, it is put into the hands of young people alongside researchers, right? And I think a paradigm of researching on versus researching with is one way to think through those possibilities. And I think tied to technology, I think about the Arthur C. Clarke quote, which I'll bastardize, around, you know, any sufficiently advanced form of technology is essentially indistinguishable from magic, right? And we can think through, you know, we can use technologies to elucidate, or we can use them to obscure, and I think we need to think through how those processes are also done alongside instead of on top of traditionally marginalized communities.
Great. Other questions, comments from the group? Harold?
So I want to go, I think this follows on your comments, Antero, but it's for all of you. So it's Steve's fourth bullet up there. So as you have done your scholarship, do you yourselves feel scholars who are pushing the boundaries of disciplines and fields, and whether you do or not, are you getting pushback from other within academia?
How do you answer that when you don't have tenure yet?
This is a safe environment.
That's being audio, I know.
Except for that.
5 years from now, when I'm going up for tenure, this will come back and haunt me. Well, my work, and Steve mentioned this, I work in a field that when we discuss issues of race and ethnicity is very much through a black-white binary. And so the fact that I'm actually introducing a third group is in itself genius to some people. I think I try to complicate, right? I don't think that I want to caution us with just including another group. I like that you use banks. Just including another group means that they just get added on to the narrative, right? And so people are like, oh, right, like Latinos exist, and they're half the children in our schools in California, and they've doubled in population in like a fifth of our states, and there is a real urgency around preparing our teachers to learn about Latina students, their history, and how to teach that history. And so, yes, I'm pushing that field in that regard, but I do think that because I'm the only one who's really talking about this in complex ways, that there's not, I don't know if there's pushback, but there are few scholars to engage with in those conversations, because unfortunately, I'm right now the most well-versed around Latino history in social studies ed. There are other people who do great work as well in their own fields. So it kind of limits the type of conversations that I can have with other scholars, and I think that people are welcoming about what I'm trying to say in the social studies ed field, but I think that the conversation can only go so far when you are one of a few, researchers engaging that work. There are people who do really great work around race and ethnicity in relation to Black and brown Black students and Black teachers, and that's people who I'm also in conversation with, but everyone, to limit that conversation just to them would be very problematic.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll ask for some minutes. Following a conversation I had earlier today, I think one of the issues, if you're going to infuse...
A little louder for us?
Yeah, if you're going to infuse equity, one of the huge questions on the university campus is if lip servicers are real. And that lip service in saying you're welcome comes into play if you investigate the extent of university-wide resource investment in culturally responsive retention efforts. Because whether we bring students in and support them or not, these students are the role models for the future students who are either encouraged or discouraged by the success and acceptance of their peers ahead of them in the line within the colleges. And so if you investigated the real resources put behind this by the university as a real commitment versus still talk without supportive action, I think that's really where it hits the road. Well, okay, that was good.
Does anybody want to respond at all to I think one of the big issues really is thinking at all about the nature of instruction in higher education. I mean, it's sort of novel for this even to be a topic of discussion. And so, what are the resources behind, and, how do we get folks in higher ed to recognize that pedagogy really is something to be examined, to be reflected on? We heard it last night in a talk that Provost Hexter sponsored with a professor from USC. She really was talking very much about trying to work with an equity scorecard with universities to help folks begin to think about the nature of instruction and how can resources be marshaled in service of thinking in new ways to engage diverse students who come to universities.
Listen to in education, in the university as the Department of Education, where people are brought together to think about education and the impacts of practice in education. And this thought is good, but does it get outside to benefit all in that STEM and the rest of the university?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to that. I think it gets a little bit to that first question too, regarding student behavior and decisions regarding value alignment with say particular jobs that they might go into. But thinking about the fact that STEM faculty, most of the pushback often is from STEM faculty regarding trying to change and infusing these issues into the STEM curriculum. Oftentimes they'll say students already have too many classes for one, too many required classes for the major. Is one of the strong pushbacks. We actually saw this at UCLA, just having a diversity requirement overall. One of the strong pushbacks was from STEM faculty saying, why are we gonna have students take an additional class? But also, so even trying to just integrate diversity issues into STEM is a whole nother conversation in of itself. I think one of the ways in which to make that change happen, I think NSF and NIH is really starting to include this, is that there's funding now from NSF, from what I know, and they're really funding institutions who are starting to do more innovative things regarding the STEM curriculum. and changing things within their department to broaden participation for students, and also this notion of civic engagement, and starting to include the importance of civic engagement in STEM. So we're starting to see new courses being developed that integrate these social and scientific issues. But often that push comes from, or that push really, and the funding comes from outside the university.
And just the comment on schools of education oftentimes not being upfront around the role of education on university campuses. I will say, in not speaking about this institution, but in my general experience, instructors in schools of ed aren't exactly the best in terms of pedagogy and what a student-centered classroom can look like. I'm speaking very generally here, but from broad experience as an adjunct while I was completing my doctoral work. And at the same time, I have seen, and again, not speaking about a specific institution, divides between the clinical folks who are engaged in the role of teacher education and field work, right? And the people who oftentimes bring in lots of grants and funding for schools of education. And I think it's time that we think through how we value the work of teacher educators, right? How we make the work of pre-service teacher educators public and validated, and not just the clinical work that's oftentimes goes untenured in ways that I think creates labor cycles, right? So the very little higher ed research I know looks at cycles of inequality as they're reinforced with undergraduates in a book like Paying for the Party or Academically Adrift. But I think we can also see the similar kinds of cycles within the labor processes in schools of education across the country too.
I wasn't criticizing schools of education, I was criticizing the rest of the campus for not having the school of education for guidance on how to educate. I like research of education.
So anyone else with a question or comment? Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, my name is Rosa Maria, and first of all, fantastic speeches from all of you. And I have a question regarding if you guys have heard of HSI, which is Hispanic Serving Institution. So UC Davis is becoming an HSI institution, and so some students feel as if they're being tokenized and used as pawns in order to get more funding, federal funding. So I wanted to get your opinion personally on what students can, there's an HSI meeting during this, so I'm trying to get I have a couple people over there, I'm here, I'm trying to get all the views on this, but so I wanted to know what you guys would like to contribute into what students can do and how we can include faculty. I was talking with my mentor, Dan, who's asked the last question on how we can have more transparency with how funding will be used in order to create stronger connections with the student community, the child Latina community. So I was wondering what input you have, what suggestions you have in order to help the situation, because at the moment, I don't know if you know, we're having a little problem with administrative. So what can we do? Yes. Any suggestions?
Again, really amazing questions, by the way. Yeah, so in terms of kind of becoming an emerging HSI, I think, my work really is, so I didn't get to touch on it because I went overtime. I don't know if you noticed. And Danny was like, get off this stage. No, but my work is really starting to become, or starting to move into, I should say, questions around students of color and minority-serving institutions, and how those contexts might play a role differently, how those contexts might affect students' outcomes for STEM Latino students or African-American students, or how those institutions may mediate the relationship between, say, their relationships with faculty, and how that might impact their outcomes. So my work is starting to move into that, and in terms of, I wouldn't recommend anything for students, and because I don't want to have that burden, like if something were to happen. But no, I think like in terms of like you're saying, I think that transparency, that it isn't just funding that comes and to use for other purposes, just using that funding for other purposes, but rather using that funding to really transform the institution to become a true HSI, truly Hispanic serving. And you have a really good resource here at UC Davis, sitting right in front of you, Marcela Cuellar, who does a lot of this work. So, not to put you on the spot, Marcela, but we're putting you on the spot.
So I think it's a really great question that you asked, and it's been, I'm not saying that I'm recommending this, but history has shown, as the historian, okay, this is the historian in me, history has shown that instead of asking for transparency or along with asking for transparency, that you are very clear in terms of what you think students need here. And a lot of that requires research on behalf of the students, whether it's surveying, and then you could ask for help on how to develop a survey, and researching what is it that students need here, researching what other HSIs have done in the past, getting in contact with those scholars who do work around the HSIs. I don't. But history has shown, this is the way I'm saving myself, history has shown that the concerns of students are served better when they are asking for a list of things that are backed up by research versus just tell us what you're going to do, because then they will tell you what they're going to do, and then what, right? So you need to be prepared for the then what.
Yeah, and so building off of that, and I think Maribel mentioned this, right? Thinking through who are your allies in kind of mobilizing this work, right? And I suspect a lot of those allies are in this room and in the other meeting that's happening at the same time, is important, right? And I think bringing that list, a mentor that also worked on youth participatory action research, always told the high school students that we worked with, never let adults leave the room without hearing your marching orders, right? Like having specific ways that you want people to move based on the things that you're trying to get is an important piece. And then I think around the two pieces that you brought up around tokenization and transparency, I'd say tokenization happens largely, I think, because of an abundance of silence, right? So if there isn't responses to and counter narratives being spun across, right, the ways that tokenization might happen, right, then I think that's where I think we see larger problems exist. And then particularly transparency, I think this is a place where we are in an era where things should be and can be more transparent than possibly ever before, right? We're in a place where maybe an institution has tried to hide Google searches of specific famous images that might have happened here, and that has not worked out very well, right? And we can think through the ways we can use digital tools and hashtags to point a spotlight on the kinds of places where transparency is missing, and youth can mobilize in ways that we've seen, happen from the Arab Spring to the Occupy movement to Black Lives Matter, and there's a trajectory and a clear tool set for doing that right now.
Great, really thoughtful responses. Should we close now? Okay, so terrific responses from our wonderful panel. And again, thank you to our 3 faculty members who really made this possible. And then I want to introduce you to our dean, Harold Levine, who has a few words to say.
So just a few words as we close. I also want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank Danny, Marcella, Alexis, Steve for organizing all this, and Steve for your comments. And of course I want to thank Antero, Maribel, and Juan for coming. It's great to have you here at UC Davis. This is billed as an emerging scholars panel. I think you're emerging only in the sense that you're relatively young in your careers, but you're clearly emerged scholars. I mean, I think the depth and the thoughtfulness of your research And thank you for not subjecting us to hours of methods presentations, but I think it's signs of really, as I said, deep and thoughtful work, and I know it will only grow richer and increase over time. I think Steve did a wonderful job of providing some sort of overarching themes. As I listened to you and trying to fit it into my own way of looking at the world, and trying to understand how scholars like you are starting to change the way we think about that world that I thought I knew, but learning about in different ways. There's some other things that came up, or maybe not other, but some additional things that came up that I heard from you. You know, of course, around equitable outcomes. You're all focused on that. Social agency is obviously important to all of you. The circumstances of students of color is the focal point. It's not added on. It's a focal point of what you do. I think, and of course, the study of these marginalized populations, giving them a narrative, giving them voice. And empathy, I heard quite a few times, and in that regard, I also heard all of you, each in your own way, in your presentations here, put a personal and historical sense on this. You, I think, are not only investigators and researchers, but part of the phenomenon that's also being studied, and your own histories and your own personal experiences lend a great deal, I think, to how you think about this in very explicit ways. I was very touched, in fact, by your Marysville slide, and I know it means a lot to you, and it certainly meant a lot to me as I heard you talk about it. So I want to, again, thank you all for coming. One of the purposes of this panel was to hear from scholars such as you so that we can educate ourselves about what some of the newest thinking is around language, literacy, culture, and history. And I think you've done that. Thank you for coming. We have a small, in addition to our gratitude and our new learnings, so we thank you for that. We also want to thank you with a little gift that's characteristic of UC Davis. It's our own bottled olive oil. So when you get home and you're making whatever you're making and you're using that olive oil, please think of us and the day here. Thank you very much.